Hi, and welcome back to another episode of ManaTutor MTG Draft. Today, we're going to be covering the undervalued cards of the set. These aren't necessarily the best cards in the set. Some of them might be your 23rd playable, but we wanted to call out at this point in the format what cards we see that are better than they're being taken, or some people are considering them not playable at all, and we have areas where you should put them in. But Matt, how has your last week or so of Bloomburrow draft gone?
It's been up and down. I've had some good successes. I'm in the middle of a pretty good run with a red-white mouse deck where I got past basically every mouse in the set. So I could have easily built a 60-card constructed with it, in fact. But, we'll see how that goes. Some other times I've been a little frustrated. I've had just some bad draws, but those things happen. So, but overall, I'm really enjoying it. How about you?
So far, it's gone well. I'm at a 69.2% win rate. So the set's treating me well. I think that's mostly due to my drafting skills. So I feel I'm good at drafting. I'm worse on gameplay. But the gameplay for this set does fit to my fortes, and it is a little bit easier gameplay, I think, this set than a lot of other sets. So that's going more smooth. Whereas I think the draft portion is a little tougher because you have to read the signals for what archetype you should be in for your seat. And I think people are having some trouble deciding, should I just go into one particular archetype early and then hope I can make that work in my seat so that I get all the synergies there? Or do I wait and stay open and maybe waste my first, half a pack of draft picks and then get into the right. So I'm good at that balance. And if you haven't checked out the last episode we just had, we had an episode released on Friday that went over how to do that. So look at that video if you have not seen that already. But the format's been treating me well and I've been enjoying it.
I think it's a great set. And with that, maybe we should get into some of these undervalued cards.
Let's do it. So you'll see here, each of us picked a few cards that we wanted to call as undervalued and talk through them. And so we'll start with Baker's Bane Duo. This might be one of the most underrated cards in the set. This one is proactively good, one of the best commons in the set. I really like these duos, even more than I thought in general. The double role of Squirrel Raccoon really helps with things like Patchwork Banner and things like that. This is at least your 2/2 for 2 that puts another food in play for foraging or to gain life down the line. But also expend 4 is not terribly hard to do to turn this into a 3/3, and that's upside from there. Just a very efficient card.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's funny that you call this undervalued because I look at it and I'm like, I value Baker's Bane Duo very highly. I take it fairly commonly whenever I'm in green, or even somewhat early on when I'm not 100% sure I'm in green, because I just know, obviously it's best in green black or green red, but I'll play this in green white. I don't mind playing it in green white. I don't mind playing, maybe not as much green blue, but it fits so well. It's never going to be a bad card, and it's almost always guaranteed to make my deck when I'm playing green. So
I still see this card wheeling, which is why I think it's undervalued. I don't think this card should ever really wheel. But I should also call out this section of the next several cards we're going over are the cards that we can't believe people are still undervalued.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, this will be some of our highest performing, most valuable cards of this episode. Another card in that category is Saber. Just a very efficient removal spell. 2 mana, -2/-2, can take out a 2 toughness creature, or in combat can take out an even more powerful creature than that. And the food bonus, again, with the foraging or the gaining life on top of that, just very valuable for 2 mana.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, again, it's funny because I don't see, I don't feel like I undervalue this card. This is a fairly high pick for me. It's excellent removal. Maybe not as high as spell or something like that, but it's, if I'm anywhere near green black, I'd probably take this over Fell in some cases, just because the extra food is going to synergize with my other cards that I'm already playing, or even white black, right? Like this is an excellent card to help your life gain triggers in that kind of a deck. And so it really is premium removal. Although I will say there are certain cases where it doesn't quite fit the bill. Certainly it's frustrating if you end up with it in hand and you can't use it like you would have Fell or something like that. Or in some instances, right, I was just playing a game with my white-red where first turn one, I put out a Heartfire hero. Second turn, I attacked with it and used Might of the Meek. And then on my opponent's turn, he tried to Saber it, and I Might of the Meeked it again in response. And his Saber just, I mean, I guess he got the food token out of it, but so it is sometimes a little risky if your opponent has a combat trick or something else they can respond with. It might just be 2 mana, get a food. But even that is not terrible, right? So like you're still getting something, and I would say that it's still an excellent card to play. Right. So next up we have Bonebindor, and I think a lot of people look at this and see it as a squirrels only card. But I mean, certainly it plays very well in the squirrels deck for good reason. But because it is a squirrel primarily. But like this can go in any black deck, and it is a at cost card. It is at rate, a 2/2 for 2, and it's one of those things where you can attack and trade this early, or block and trade it early, and then late game you can use it to bring something back. It's also particularly great in blue black, because you can, if you end up milling this or discarding it for some reason for threshold, or you end up milling or discarding your Huskburster Swarm, or something like that, you can then bring your Wix Patrol or your Huskburster Swarm or whatever your finisher back to your hand with this late game. And I can't believe that this card wheels. I saw it wheel just today in 2 different packs, and I have no idea how that happened.
Yeah, this was one of my favorite cards in the episode we shot before the set came on out. I had this amongst my top black commons. It is a little underpowered, compared to say Saber and things like that, but it's a really good card. It's a 2-drop, fill out that slot that can be a 2-for-1 in any of your decks where you're milling, like the Squirrels deck, or even if you just have out a Daggerfang duo and you mill this, it's a free card, off of that from your graveyard. So, I guess the one thing I liked it too much early on, where I was trying to play 3 to 4 of them in a deck. You don't need that. I think you top out at 2.
Good. 2's a great number for that.
Yeah, but it's a great card. And yes, I agree. Undervalued, and I don't see how. It's
it's funny because this will all, like, I cannot imagine a situation where I take 2 of these and they don't both make the deck. All right, so next up, this one might be a little controversial, but I wanted to bring this one up. Bumbleflower Shareot. It looks underpowered, but I will say that I think that this card is while it's probably not as high up as the ones we've talked about so far in this, I still see this as very undervalued. This is decent removal. It's also gets you a food token, and it gets 2 non-creature permanents on the board. And there are things that care about that. In fact, I think we're going to talk about one next. But it does help a lot with things. And I think the idea of being able to play this on turn 2, maybe if you don't hit your creature drop on turn 2, get a food, survive a little bit to the late game, and then just have it sitting there as a potential threat, it can cause your opponent to, not play a card that they don't want blown up, or, which could give you an opening to attack in or something like that. There are lots of potential uses for this. Obviously, the downside of only being able to activate it as a sorcery is a little bit of it is a downside, clearly, right? But I actually like this card better than, say, Early Winter, which is the 5 mana destroy target, or is it exile or destroy target creature? I think it's exile.
Exile, yeah.
Yeah, exile. Because this also, it gets you the food, and then the fact that you can destroy a non-land permanent with this can blow up an enchantment, it can blow up an artifact. This is just anything you need to get rid of later in the game, it's there. So I think, again, it's not the best card, and I wouldn't necessarily pick this highly, but I can definitely see playing one of these, or maybe 2, in a lot of different decks where, I can't seem to find other good removal that fits in my color. So, like, particularly, say, in white decks where you do have some removal, but it's not as good, or blue decks where you do have some removal, but it's mostly like return to hand or put on top of your opponent's deck. These can really kind of help fill the niche.
Yeah, and I agree that this is undervalued, and we didn't talk about all these cards beforehand. We
Yeah.
made our list, and but I agree that this is undervalued, and I might instead put this to a cards that's easy to underrate because we have a section of that.
Yeah.
Because I understand how people would underrate this card. It is inefficient, right?
Right.
But you do get a good amount out of it with the food token, the things you can do with that, and the destruction of any permanent. And
Yeah.
also the fact that this leaves you open, right? You can
Right.
slot this into any of your
Yeah,
decks that you want
absolutely.
that
It's
runs short on
colorless
removal.
removal.
I basically take this thinking, all right, I hope I cut this,
Right.
but if I don't, I know I have that security blanket of I have my removal I need to get rid of any bomb or whatever, and I'm going to be able to play it. So it's a nice security blanket.
So next up, we have Builder's Talent, kind of a segue from Bumbleflower Shareot. These two cards actually work very well together.
Yeah.
And so I look at this as like, if I get a Builder's Talent, I'm almost actively, and I think I'm going to play it, and I think I'm playing white, I almost actively look for a Bumbleflower Shareot or two, because this card just synergizes incredibly well for it and gets you insane. It actually makes Bumbleflower Shareot a very good value card. I mean, at first glance, this doesn't seem that impressive, right? 2 mana to get a wall, and then you upgrade it, and whenever you one or more non-creature, non-land permanents you control enter, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, right? So there aren't a ton of non-creature, non-land permanents, right? There's obviously enchantments, there's artifacts, but they're not as common. I will say white with enchantment removal that it has.
Banishing Light.
Banishing Light, that's the one. There is some other synergies with this, but I think it's really good. And then when you level it up to level 3, you return a non-creature, non-land permanent from graveyard to the battlefield. So that can synergize incredibly well late game with your Bumbleflower Shareot. Obviously, you're at that point you're sinking quite a bit of mana into this, but I look at it as a great way to potentially resolve stalled board states late game. If you get into a situation where you have a lot of creatures, your opponent has a lot of creatures, when you level this up to level 3 and you bring your Bumbleflower Shareot back, you're getting 2+1/+1 counters, you're getting a food token, you're getting the ability to destroy another creature that your opponents have. And so again, I would think this might fall better into the next category of cards that it's easier to undervalue. But I see this card, I've last picked this card several times, right? And so I don't quite understand why it's going that low.
Yeah, so I must say I'm kind of guilty for undervaluing this too. When I look at this, I see it as not that great of a card. That said, I look at stats and I recognize when the stats say otherwise that I am probably the wrong one. And that means, I can recognize that I need to think about why this card is good and trust that it could be better. I think people too often blow off the stats. Like, yes, stats
Right.
can be misleading. Sometimes sample size a problem, things like that. But I think they do that too often, and that more often they would learn more by looking at the stats and then questioning why they may be wrong, not why the stats are wrong.
Right.
And I think this is a case here. And when I look at this, I think, okay, the 0/4 for 2 mana base case itself is not that great, but that's in most sets, whereas this set is a bunch of small creatures.
Right.
This basically walls off every creature that I'm worried about my opponent having until the late game.
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, a 0/4, on turn 2, that keeps you insulated probably for 2 to 3 turns, and that's nothing to laugh at.
And then the rest is all upside from there. And that Banishing Light case of the level 3 that you talked about, I could see that definitely playing out. I have not experienced it or done it myself, but I'm guessing a case like that helps bring this up to even better than the base case that we were talking about.
Right, and it's not just Bumbleflower Shareot or things. You can bring back Carrot Cake with this. That's an excellent use of bringing back after you've sacrificed your Carrot Cake, bringing that back late game. You get another food token, you get another rabbit, you sacrifice again, you get to scry. Like there's a ton of synergy, I feel like, with this card, particularly because it's in white, that allows you to get a lot of stuff. You get that, and then you get the +1/+1 counters on your creatures as well. So like it can synergize really well with certain white decks. I'll say that, like, because it will not work with every white deck, but it will work with some of them. And if you're in that position where you might be playing 2 to 3 copies of Carrot Cake or a Bumbleflower Shareot. Like I'd say that's when you give this card a serious look as something that can really, really pop off several times.
Next, we're going to look at a series of cards that people are underrating because they look like they go into one archetype, but actually go into multiple. And we're starting off with Tree Guard Duo. I think a lot of people see this and they think about this is a card for the go wide strategy where I have a bunch of creatures out. And quite frankly, this plays well in all the green archetypes.
Absolutely.
As long as you have several creatures out, this actually becomes, it looks understated as a 3/4 for 4. And I'll admit, going into the set, I probably underrated this. I don't remember my grade, but I think it was lower than it should be. And because what this really reads as is a 3/4 for 4, destroy your opponent's worst creature, because they are going to have to chump block most likely, or they take a ton of damage. Either way,
right.
That's a win for you for that amount of mana. I'm going to be looking at cards like this in the future with a little bit higher grade, and keep in mind that it effectively is a destroy something small tacked on to the card.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And the fact that it also gives vigilance, right, is not only it's destroy something your opponent has that's small or deal damage and still have a blocker usually.
Yeah.
And so, that turn 4 can't be underrated, right? The other thing I want to mention that I really love this in green red with Bark Knuckle Boxer, right? This with Bark Knuckle Boxer is just stupid, right?
Creature. Yep.
Yeah, an indestructible. You're going to swing with it. They're either going to take like 6 or 7 damage, or they're going to block it. And so on turn 4, that's great. That is not by any means the only card that this synergizes really well with, but I happen to love it with that. And so yes, I agree. It definitely goes best in the go wide strategy, right? Because giving things more power toughness for the turn is better, right? But even if you only have 2 or 3 creatures out on the board, this is not a bad card. It benefits a ton from almost any deck that it's in. I will say, you would think because of the fact that this is a duo and it's a frog, I think green-blue is the worst deck for this. Because you never really want to blink this, because most of the blink effects come back at end of turn, and then the effect is basically wasted.
Also, I think people need to keep in mind, so this is kind of reading as like a, not a trick, but like a pump spell and a creature in one. A lot of times, cards get value of having multiple effects within a single piece of cardboard, because it's only costing you that one piece of cardboard, which is the same reason I don't really like 1-drops, because I don't feel they're quite worth a piece of cardboard. I do like cards that, even if the 2 pieces are not extremely relevant, like having +2/+2 or so, +3/+3, whatever, at sorcery speed on something, like I wouldn't usually spend a card for that.
Right.
And I wouldn't spend a card for a 3/4 4 mana costed card, but getting both those effects in one card,
absolutely,
that has a lot of value.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good segue into the next card, actually, because I think that is that same point.
Yeah, and up next we have Cash Grab, which is the same point. And I will say, Matt, you were right on this one. I said I really would only want to put this in the squirrels deck. I think more specifically, I'd want to make sure that I'm open to going down squirrels. And it really works in just about all the green decks. I will say I still want to have some squirrels in my deck to make sure I can get that food, but quite frankly, I'm playing Baker's Bane Duo on all my green decks. I'm playing some squirrels in all my green decks. And so it just works out that I'm always going to be able to get the value in all my green decks anyway.
Yes. Yeah. And the thing about this is you don't have to play a lot of squirrels, but even if you have 1 or 2 cards that can forage later, obviously, to your point, you want the food token if you can at all get it. I probably wouldn't play this if I wasn't playing any squirrels, but I mean, if I'm playing 2 or 3, then this is not, it may not make the cut in every deck, but I think it would make most. So kind of similarly, again, talking about multiple effects, getting great bonuses, is Carrot Cake. Obviously, I don't know that this card is undervalued at all. I think people do value this card pretty high. I rarely see this, almost never see this wheeling.
Yeah, they undervalued it before 17 land stats came on out. People are picking it up fast now. They're picking this over most uncommons, I'd say, even, and I think some people are taking it over a lot of rares too. So
right. But I think the point to make with this card will fit basically in any white deck. There's almost no circumstance or no color pairing, no archetype where this is not a good card to have. Right? It's obviously better in certain archetypes. It is excellent in green white. It is excellent in white black. But it is going to be fine in almost any white deck. The one caveat I might make to that is if you're playing an extremely aggressive white red, maybe it's not going to make the cut in the deck because it is a little slower. But I will say one of the things that I love about this the most is the scry. The scry is an incredibly good mechanic, and I think you and I were talking a little bit about offline about how one of the more important things to do is even out your draws, and the ability to, even if you sacrifice this on your upkeep and you lose 2 lands for that turn, the ability to see what you're going to draw and decide whether you need it can be a valuable thing to do. And so this card really can help because you get a double scry off of it, timing that appropriately so that you're able to get 2 scries and decide whether you need those cards is really, really great. So that's all. That's, I think, all I have to say. I mean, it's an excellent card, and we've talked a little bit about it already on previous things, but
yeah, I almost would go as far to say that this went from being an undervalued card to almost being an overvalued card, in that I just can't pick it up myself. People need to start valuing it lower so I can play it more.
I was going to say, I'm not sure this card can be overvalued. I mean, I would play 2, maybe 3 copies of this in some decks. Like, I mean, 3 might be too much, but it depends on the deck, right? And I think there are certainly circumstances where I could see 3 copies fitting depending on what else is in the deck.
I will say, like, it go to your point. I'm not trying to play white blue personally, and I'm not playing this in white red. So 2 of the 4 white decks, I'm not playing it. Therefore, I might pick it up later than some other people are picking it up, and that might be my problem. But if you are steering down a path where white green or white black are an option for you, this is basically your best common.
Right. Well, I don't know if I'd say best common. It's an excellent common, and you should obviously value it. Now, I might take like Fell's uncommon, but I might take like a Saber depending on the circumstance. But like, it's an excellent common.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Yeah. So like, so the cards that I would pick in white. Okay, so white, black, and white, green, because I will take Baker's Bane Duo over this because it fits into more decks. But say if I knew I was going into white, black, or white, green, I would either be Intrepid Rabbit or this. And Saber's the same thing as Baker's Bane Duo. I'd take it first because I think it goes into more decks ultimately. But I don't know. Yeah, I think I'd take Carrot Cake. If I knew I was going to one of those 2 decks, it would be Carrot Cake first.
Right. And it is, again, it's very high. Like, I do think Intrepid Rabbit's probably higher. That might be the only white common that is higher than this in my pick order generally. But this is, we're splitting hairs in a very minor way here. It's an excellent card.
It was just an interesting discussion. In fact, it might be worth an episode down the line here to give our like pick orders rather than like strength of cards. Like, what would our pick order be for commons, uncommons, stuff like that?
Yeah. Absolutely. So next up we have Raccoon Rallier, which again, it's one of those 2/2 for 2s. This is not a bad 2-drop in a lot of different decks. I think it obviously goes very well in the Valiant decks, in the white-red archetype, because it's a repeatable source of targeting something. And at a 2/2 for 2, it's a decent rate. But I wouldn't sleep on this in green-red. This is the kind of thing where you can put down your big, beefy creature and then give it haste, right? If it doesn't already have haste. Like, I'm thinking like your Hive Spine Wolverine, even your Scrap Shooter, right? On turn 3, give it haste, swing in for 4. There's a lot of cases where something like this can just help you get in that little bit of extra damage early, or helps close out the game where you might have a big creature in hand and your opponent just, swung in and you have the opportunity to kill them on the crackback. I think this card is maybe not as useful as some of the other ones we've talked about, but I do really like it, and I think it fits pretty well in a number of red decks. I wouldn't even say it's bad in red black, right? Like there are definitely cases where being able to put down a lizard and swing in is useful, right? So some of the lizards have some really good abilities that can trigger. So yeah, I'd say this card is pretty good.
Admittedly, I'm not that high on this card, but I will say I do like picking up 2-drops when I don't know what else to pick. And
Yes.
this kind of like how the Bumbleflower Shareot is
Yeah.
a safety blanket to me on removal. This is a safety blanket to me on ensuring I fill out my 2-drop slot. And I will replace it if I get enough 2-drops down the line, but I'm not horribly disappointed if I don't fill that out and I end up playing this.
Yeah, no, I just like it, especially I think in the archetypes we've talked about, white red and red green, where it can really make a difference in the game, I think. And red green particularly because green has enough trample in it that I feel like being able to give something haste and trample really can help swing the game. All right, so next up we have Tangle Tumbler, and this is another one that I think people are kind of sleeping on a little bit. I see these commonly go as one of the last 3 picks in a pack, and it's an uncommon, obviously. So I think this card is very obviously it's only useful if you can generate tokens, but I think there's enough token generation out there that it should not be that difficult to find. If you are in white at all, you will probably have the tokens to use this. If you are in archetypes where you have a lot of offspring, you will be able to use this. I think that it's one of those things that people need to be more aware of, right? Obviously, I wouldn't recommend picking this early before you know whether you're going to have tokens at all. But I think it's fairly easy to get enough to get 2 tokens, right? And obviously, food tokens can count for this. So don't necessarily sleep on it. Like this is not bad in a squirrels deck, for example. And so I think it's one of those things like being able to play this on turn 3 and potentially use it on turn 4 as a 6/6. If you have the deck that can do that, it's certainly a really good card. The only other thing I'd want to mention about it is that the tap ability on this doesn't require it to be a creature. And so even if you don't immediately have the tokens for it, or it is not completely useless. Paying 3 to tap this and put a 1/1 counter on a creature is not the worst thing in the world. And it can often help with a stalled board state. And I think a lot of people kind of sleep on that ability a little bit. They look at this and they're like, well, I don't have any tokens, or I only have a few token generating things. Whereas like this is not an immediately useless card. Now, obviously I wouldn't put it in unless there was a good chance that you could make it a creature on the regular. But it's still, I think, a very good thing. And the fact that it has vigilance is great because you have that ability to still tap it for the 1/1.
Yeah, so I'm not quite in the camp where I would very rarely play this. I'm in that camp, but I always challenge myself. You put this on the list. I looked at the win rate. The win rate's also low. Now, I will say this though: it's very possible that cards that have to be put in the right deck to be good often have the bad stats, and those are the ones
because they get put in decks they shouldn't be put in.
Right. So I guess I'm going to 95% of my decks. I will not put this in. But I can see how this might be undervalued in the case that you can land in one of those 5% of the decks that are creating tons of food. I have been in a squirrels deck where I have all the cash grabs, all the sabers, all the duo,
Baker's Bane Duo. Yeah.
Baker's Bane Duo. So I'm just turboing out food. I've had five food on the battlefield before.
Right.
So I could see if I had picked up a Tangle Tumbler and that, it might be useful. So I would love to be able to filter the stats to see, what a critical mass of early food generators, how Tangle Tumbler does in those cases. But yeah, I haven't.
Sure.
Can't do that. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where again, I would not take this highly, but I do think people sometimes just skip over it. They look at it and they're like, oh, that's a vehicle. It requires me to tap 2 tokens. I'm never going to be able to use that. And I think people need to maybe take a step back, think about it, because I have played this in a couple of decks where I had 3 to 5 token generators, and it was fairly reliable, right? Like when you draw this, it's useful. It's also important to remember that there are so many cards in this that gift tokens, right? And so something that I think people also sleep on a little bit is there are cases where your opponent may well give you a food token or give you a tapped fish, and you can't rely on that all the time. Again, I wouldn't put this in a deck that didn't have any token generators, but that is just an additional situation where you might get 1 or 2 tokens that you can then use to help power this down the line.
Up next, we have a section of cards that are easy to underrate that we want to bring to light on why we think they're underrated. Bark Form Harvester is quite a good card in any deck that is going for the foraging and the threshold mechanics, because it's not hard in this format to deck yourself or to be decked. There's that talent, the rare black talent, the Scavenger's talent, I think.
Scavenger's talent, yeah.
I've faced that several times and gotten near to being decked. I actually definitely have been decked at least once, if not twice. And otherwise too, I've gotten very close to decking myself, and I've definitely won a couple games with only 1 card in my deck. So it comes up where you want to be able to prevent yourself from decking. This card does that. And it's every creature type, and that's useful for everything as well. I don't think you want to be putting this in every deck. This is only if you are, milling yourself basically in some fashion that you want to have this in. But having 1 copy of this, I've been really happy with, and the win rates do support that as well.
I have not decked myself or had someone deck me in any of my games so far, so I might be a little bit lower on this, but I have picked up copies before. I don't think I've actually had one that made my deck, but I would think of this kind of similarly to how you describe some of the other cards, almost like a safety blanket, in case you get milled, or you self-mill a card you don't want to mill, or you get into a situation with a stalled board state and you are at risk of running out of cards. It's situationally useful, but I agree that it's one of those things where it could very well be your 23rd card, right?
Up next, we have High Stride. It just gives a good amount of value for 1 mana, and it's not one I want to run multiple copies of. I want 1 of these in a lot of my green decks, not every green deck, but where I especially liked this card was when I really want to trigger Expend, because I put quite a bit more 3 mana cost and 2 mana cost cards in my deck than 4. And so my 2s, I can double spell in my 2s and be fine, right? But with my 3 mana costs, I can't quite get to that last mana to expend. And also, we all know that spending our mana efficiently every turn is a big route to how you win in Magic. And, just being able to have that one thing set aside in your hand where you can leave up 1 mana and do something impactful. You need the right timing on it. Don't get me wrong, for this card to be good. But I find that you can often find that case where you have an opportunity to leave up that 1 mana to make a game-changing play by playing this High Stride.
Right, yeah. And I think that's absolutely right. I think this card gets overlooked a lot when, somebody's attacking in and you only have 1 mana up, right? People are typically not, at least at this point, assuming that you have the High Stride in hand. Sometimes they will, right? And sometimes they'll play extra, but most of the time they're not going to think, oh, well, he's got 1 mana up. I'm assuming he has a High Stride. And it makes it very useful obviously for blocking purposes, particularly blocking flyers. And it can clutch save a card, right, from take out the trash or something like that. If it's even if it's just a 1/1, but it's a really good 1/1 that you need to keep alive, right? 1 mana does that. Or from a Saber or whatever, that you may be like, well, I need to keep this creature needs to stay alive because it has a mechanic that I absolutely have to have. And so I think there's a number of really good uses for this card. So next up we have Crumb and Get It, and this is kind of actually very similar to High Stride, right? In it's that kind of combat trick, like you said, Jeremy, that it can really help smooth out your drops. If you're sitting with 4 mana, I mean, I think you're less worried about expend in white most of the time, but it can still help, on those drops where you have a 3-drop and you have an extra mana laying around, and you can use this on the offense, you can use this on the defense. Being able to give something indestructible is really good for 1 mana. Even if you have to give your opponent a food, sometimes you're not always going to want to do that, but the times that you do want to do it, it works. Sometimes, you don't care if they have a food because they're tapped out and you're about to kill them. So, giving your creature indestructible so that you don't lose it is useful, or get for the extra 2 damage and you don't have to give it indestructible. So yeah, this card is, I think, very similar to High Stride, and it's a cheap, efficient combat trick, and those are always good for a copy or 2. Again, I think this follows the previous 2. This is Scales of Shale, so it is, I think, a little less universally as useful as High Stride and Come and Get It, but this card really also, you shouldn't sleep on it, right? +2/+0, lifelink and indestructible. Even for, I wouldn't want to play this often for 3 mana, but
it's passable.
It's passable. It's passable. And what really does it for me is the lifelink, because it's the kind of thing that your opponent's not going to be expecting it. And it can help survive in situations where you attack in, you're both kind of at low life. You can't quite kill your opponent, but they might think you're dead on the crackback. And then you power up a 3/3 or a 4/4. And all of a sudden you're gaining 6 life or 5 life. And then your opponent can still swing all in, but not kill you. Or using this on the defense to kill one of your opponent's creatures and gain a lot of life can be particularly useful if they swing in and you maybe don't have enough blockers without the life gain. It's the kind of thing where this can very well swing a close game in the end. Again, I would love, this is obviously better in Lizards. I probably wouldn't play it in a number of other black archetypes, or at least not rate it super highly. But it can sometimes be that 23rd card, and it's a decent combat trick because it can often throw your opponent off guard.
The next section that we have is cards that fill into a particular archetype. And first up, we have Ravine Raider. This goes into the archetype that goes alongside the Scales of Shale. We didn't put Scales of Shale there because we see other cases where you could use that card. But Ravine Raider, I do think this is pretty important to the black-red strategy. Yeah. There is no other way I want to start off black-red than with this 1-drop. Granted, you should be able to get that late, and that should be a signal if you're in, say, red or black and you see this late. You probably are able to pivot into the other color to be black-red, but it's a good card in black-red. Don't sleep on this as inefficient 1-drop. It's exactly what you want for that deck.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the menace is, and the menace is the entire reason for it, right? I mean, obviously the pumping is great, but putting down, one of the reasons I don't like to play 1/1s for 1 is because generally by the time your opponent gets a 2-drop on the board, it's irrelevant. And so you've, maybe swung in for 1, but like you said, what is that piece of cardboard or virtual cardboard on Arena doing to earn its place in your deck? And I think the thing for this is it has that ability to go into the late game and be difficult to block. And then, you force your opponent to make a difficult choice sometimes with this, because if they decide not to block it and you've got mana open, congratulations, right? Like, they're now taking more damage. So I think this is a great, screw with your opponent's mind card a little bit. And, obviously it just fits really well with the Lizard synergies. So it can often help you trigger that, those bonus abilities on the Lizards. If your opponent doesn't have enough blockers, you can just swing in for 1 with this and then play your Lizard that gets a +1/+1 counter, or allows you to pick the card from your opponent's hand and force them to discard it, right? So they're Thoughtstalker Warlock, right? There's a number of really good uses for this card.
Yeah, early in the game, this is all about being able to trigger that Thoughtstalker Warlock type of effect of dealing damage to your opponent and getting extra value off of it. Later in the game, it's good as a finisher because it can pump at that point. And in the middle of the game, it's best as a 1/1 menace that your opponent, yes, they could block, but you have threat of activation if they do, right? So it's all about, you don't want to really be pumping it mid-game, but the fact that you could makes it so they still can't block it type of it.
Right. Yeah. Or they decide to block it, right? And then you just have the option of Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
You just have the option of whether you want to trade it or not. And that gives you power over your opponent, right? Because they have to make a decision before you make the decision. And that's generally a good position to be in.
Up next, we have Glide Dive Duo. It deserved a spot on this list, even though we've talked about it before as being a good card. But yeah, this one goes into your black, red, and black, white archetype. So it's two of the black archetypes. So therefore, we put it like it goes in specific archetypes. I don't want to be playing outside of those two, but it is good in both those two. So I do think it's undervalued right now, even in those archetypes. So just want to call out that you should be willing to pick this up and very happy to play it.
I'd actually add a third archetype to that. I think this goes fairly well in some black blues. If you are able to pick up a few of those blue flicker cards, right? Being able to, phase this out, bring it back, or exile it, bring it back, right? You don't want to bounce this and bring it back because 5 mana is a lot. But if you have different ways to trigger it, I'm thinking of and I'm forgetting the name of this because I'm horrible with card names, but the 3-cost frog that when it comes into play, you can make something unblockable. And then once it hits your opponent, you have the option to exile it and bring it back, right? That's a free 5 damage, so, and 2 life gain for you. So I think there's definitely a case for this in blue-black, but it depends on the blue-black.
I hear you on that. And I agree that it's a possibility. I did look up the stats in blue-black on this. It's not that great. Sure. But then again, that might be a syndrome of people not using it right as well.
Right. And I think that might be because people sometimes when they play blue-black, they don't play the frogs, right? And there are certain frogs that there's a fair number of good black ETB triggers, right? I'm thinking Wix Patrol, right? I think you could build an excellent blue-black control deck using, flicker mechanics and great ETB triggers on things like this and Wix Patrol. And so I think only in the right blue-black would this be really powerful. But I can certainly see a case for it. I have not been able to build that blue-black yet, but I would love to try it someday.
I built it and I did trophy with it. But
so there you go.
I'm still trying to avoid blue-black these days because I do think it is the 8th best archetype, and therefore I'm trying not to get into it in the first place. But blue-black is the deck that I think is doing worse now. And as the archetypes, people are starting to draft differently and pick up basically your black, green, and whites more readily. I do think the blue and black will be what wins, right? Goes up in value over time. And that will be the pivot after about week 2, week 3 in the format. So while I'm not trying to draft blue-black now, once I see those signals change, I will want to draft it. And the version I'll draft is a straight-up control version, killing things 1-for-1ing early, and then doing a lot of this shenanigans with flickering down, later in the game.
All right, so next up we have Polluted Provisioner. I don't know that I would call this card super undervalued, but I do see these fairly late. And so I think it is worth talking about. This card obviously goes best in white, green, and white, red. I think those are the 2 archetypes that this card really fits well into. I think it particularly fits really well into white, red, and my current white, red is running 2 of these because of the Valiant triggers with this. Don't sleep on a 3/4 flyer, right? A 3/4 flyer is a good card, and the fact that it gives a +1/+1 counter on something else when it comes into play, it's almost like it's not a 4/5 for flyer for 5, but it's almost that, right? And so the ability to make something bigger on the ground is great. If you have flicker mechanics of any sort, this can also be somewhat okay. But you then need to have other creatures on the ground. Yeah, I mean, what do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, it's just not a bad card, right? It gives you enough. Your 4/5 for 5 comment was basically, with flying was roughly what I thought on this card. In some ways I can see you playing this as a, 23rd, 22nd card, but it's more like if you needed some top end that you didn't get, this is passable top end that you'll be happy to play,
I'm not trying to go too much above passable for top end, but
obviously we're not saying we love these cards, right? This is not something I'm picking highly. It's more like I was given this.
Right.
It'll make my deck barely.
More often than not, yeah.
Yeah.
When as like the 22nd or 23rd. Yeah.
Up next, we have Dire Downdraft, which is the top blue common, and this goes into green blue. The reason I say it goes into green blue is that's the best that's the best blue deck. It actually goes into all your blue decks, but try
you
to
don't want to be playing the other one.
Yeah. So I do think this is still underrated for what it can do because, you know, this is a form of removal. And I think a lot of times people don't read it that way. So, you know, again, not like extremely high praise. Don't be, you know, first picking this or anything close, but it's a good card that you should be playing in your blue decks.
Right. I will say there are also fun circumstances that you can get into with this card in terms of using it to respond to some of your opponent's plays, like in response to a Wix Patrol, which requires you to mill. Then it is effectively just remove a creature at that point, because they're either going to put it on top and it's going in their graveyard, or they're going to put it on the bottom and probably never see it again. So I would say there are definitely uses where this is better removal than it looks like on paper. But it requires you to essentially be responding to something where they're having to mill.
There was an interesting case with this card that came up in a game I played where it was used against me. I played that black card, black for look at your opponent's hand, gift them a card, and then take a card from them, and you can play that.
Cruel Claw type.
Yeah. So I took their best creature, put it onto the battlefield, and then they end up Dire Downdrafting that, which is basically remove that creature, put it on the top of their library to be able to use next. Yeah, it was just interesting. And last up, we have Lightshow Duo. It's just a decently rated card for blue. You get a 3/4 with prowess, 4/4, which kind of makes up for the fact that it's understated. And you get a Surveil 2, and Surveil 2 is just enough to push this up into a decent card rate. Like the Surveil helps add to your threshold, which you want to be able to do in blue. It helps you filter for the right cards. To some degree, they say, you know, Scries and Surveils are essentially worth half a card, right? Because you can kind of put any lands if you don't need them, or lands if you do need them. You can kind of filter for that and to be able to draw into your next card. So in some ways, this is almost like draw a card as well. Not quite, but it helps you kind of see that it's not a bad card because it can do all that.
I will say it is effectively, you know, designed for the two worst decks in the two worst archetypes right now. Blue black and blue red, but
white blue is worse than blue black. Don't be ditching blue black that much.
Yeah, maybe, but I guess I haven't looked at the exact win rates on it, but you know, I tend to see blue black currently is not doing so hot, but
it's not. It's third to last. So
yeah, that's fair. But yeah, I mean, I think it's actually pretty good in green blue though, I guess, if you have a way to flicker it, right? And you want to continually surveil, like, you know, there's probably better cards to flicker, but this does something at least, right? So
it's another serviceable blue card.
Yeah.
That's basically what we can say. But you know, still people are probably underrating this, because if you're in blue, you don't have much else to be picking on up, to be honest. And this is really what you want to be having if you're going to be in blue and playing blue cards.
Yeah, and I mean, it is the second best blue common after Dire Downdraft, right? And when we say second best, that means it has a 56% win.
We're really talking up blue as like the best winner of this format, right?
So those are some of the cards that we think might be a little bit undervalued so far in Bloomburrow. Obviously, again, that doesn't mean these are not always good cards, right? As we just kind of talked about with Lightshow Duo, it's a little bit of a, well, it's the best of what you've got in blue commons, or among the best of what you've got in blue commons. But we do think that people might be, you know, sleeping on a few of these a little bit in certain circumstances where you might need them or might want them. Some of you might have different ideas, so feel free to sort of leave in the comments if you think there's any cards that we missed. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And I think we'll be back next, maybe with you know, more of an in-depth dive into an archetype or maybe a draft. What do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, something along those lines. We mentioned pick orders as well, but draft
pick orders.
of that. So we'll figure that out. But if you put something in the comments below and let us know a request on a particular archetype you want us to deep dive in, for example, we're happy to take requests and move into that.
And we'll see you in the next one.
See you in the next one.
Bye.